you know, we've all, especially a guy like me, I mean, I'm on this stupid thing 10 hours a day sometimes. So
I
to be
believe it.
honest, you know, if I was walking somewhere or driving somewhere, I'd probably get there a little bit earlier to set up, but I literally, you know, half the time I'm not even, I'm in shorts, but at least today I'm in the office. So that's nice.
Well, good, good. We're so glad.
Yeah.
And we completely understand that. Oh, man.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Who hasn't had it?
Yes.
So, you know, whenever you guys are ready to go, you say the word. I'll make a couple of opening comments and make our way right into it.
Okay, sounds good. All right, I think we can go ahead and do that. Let's see. I'm trying to make us go live here and record. Okay. All right. All right. I think we're live. Let's see. All right. Well, hello and welcome everyone. We're so glad that you all could join us. My name is Whitney and I am the Water Quality Program Manager for the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy. And I am joined by our conservationist, Carol Markham, and our co-host from the Canandaigua Lake Watershed Association, Lindsay McMillan, who is their association director. And both of our organizations are so happy to have presenting for us today, Dr. Frank Rossi. Dr. Rossi is an associate professor at Cornell University in the School of Integrative Plant Science and is an Extension Turfgrass specialist. And we're so excited to hear his presentation today. Following the presentation, we will do a very, very brief survey, followed by a live Q&A session with Dr. Rossi. So please feel free to go ahead and submit your questions as you think of them throughout the presentation. We don't want you to forget those questions. I know sometimes I think of something and then I'm watching the presentation and completely forget by the end of it what my question was. So you don't need to wait. It's not going to disrupt the presentation. You can go ahead and submit those. We just ask that you do so in the Q&A box rather than in the chat box because they are a lot easier for us to manage from there. We don't want to miss anybody's questions. The chat feed sometimes gets going and it's easy to miss things. So please feel free to submit those throughout and go ahead and put them in the chat box. And we don't want to delay. We're excited to hear what you have to say. And so we're going to let you take it away.
Thanks very much, Whitney. Really appreciate that. I gotta have the ability to share my screen. Can I take the host or you have to stop sharing? Okay, now we're good. Yep, now we're good.
Good.
Okay, and there we go. And we'll go right to this. And you can see the slide?
Yes, looks great.
Good. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm getting to be an old hand at this. This is the third or fourth time I've worked with the Canandaigua folks. And I was hoping, you know, before the world took a left turn, was hoping to get out to Lake Chautauqua because that part of the state is one I haven't got to explore as much, but it is near and dear to people like Lucille Ball and all the people that are from the Jamestown area, Lake Chautauqua, and the beautiful musical stuff that goes on out there. And of course, I'm a lot more familiar with Canandaigua living close. But what I'm so pleased to talk to you about is the 217 lakes that make up New York State and the rivers. We are, of course, first and foremost, a Great Lakes state, right? I think when I collaborate with colleagues around the country who do what I do for a living, study grassland systems in urban areas, golf courses, sports fields, lawns, cemeteries, airports, parks, you name it, these things interact in certain states heavily with water. I mean, there's some states that have no natural water, oddly enough, in them. So we're, of course, very fortunate to have this wealth of freshwater resources. And because of it, they're vulnerable to all the stuff we do, not just lawns, but every part of our society. And of course, over the years, what have we learned? We've learned that agriculture places a significant burden on our freshwater supply, right? And, I'm not pointing fingers, but we need to look at the totality of the issues that we're dealing with, the scale of the issues that we're dealing with, and then think about, it's the old think globally, act locally, right? So obviously, the whole idea of, getting rid of everything and not doing a thing on your lawn and banning everything and writing laws and don't cut them and, throw the whole baby out with the bathwater, right? Probably isn't the most responsible way to deal with this, but I will say this. This should be an area we should be able to make adjustments a lot easier than we have to make in large systems like production agriculture, constructing roads, constructing houses, the way we do wastewater systems. I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody on this call, whether you're a commercial person or a lakefront property owner, the challenge and the potential threat that lakeside sewage systems put on these water resources, right? And this is well known across New York State. We've got failing wastewater systems throughout New York State that continue to contribute to this big problem. And it's a problem that's happened on a really large scale, right? I mean, just one state. Start thinking about the Chesapeake Bay watershed, right? Start thinking about the Great Lakes watershed, the Mississippi Delta, which we know the impairments that's happening down there. So I don't think I need to rant with people who live and care about lakes, but I think for my commercial partners today, the folks that I work with, maybe who do this for a living, are professional landscapers, are somewhat trained and licensed and certified to do certain things as part of the job requires when there's pesticides and things like that. So certainly when I'm talking to a professional audience, I'm having a different conversation than I'm having to a consumer audience. But for sure, no matter which audience I'm talking to, it's really important that you understand the scope and scale of what it is we're trying to do and how little things can make big differences. But sometimes you have to be creative. So I'll thank everybody again for having me. It's so great to work with you all. I always feel like, this is really exactly what the land grant mission charges me to do as your state extension specialist, is to be available, be a resource for these kinds of issues where it's really good to be informed about, right? The critical aspect of what we're doing here is we're trying to make informed decisions about the way we manage these landscapes that are immediately adjacent or could potentially impact the health and well-being of that lake water, right? That's what we're talking about. So working with everybody is exactly what I need to be doing. And I want to thank you all for continuing to have me. It's always nice for a guy like me to be invited back anywhere a second time. So I'm happy that we've been able to have this partnership over the years. And I hope it continues to strengthen in the future. All right, so I always tell the commercial people, and I don't know why they don't do this, but I think it's critical that commercial landscapers are integrated into these lake friendly discussions. These kinds of discussions that come from the homeowners, the property owners, right? Are the people who do this people who do it themselves, take care of their lawn themselves? And if they take care of it themselves, what do? Do they apply a typical, Scott's Northern 4-step program? Do they just put weed and feed in the spring, or do they just cut? Do they irrigate their lawn because they like it well? Do they go out and squirt and spot treat weeds, right? Have they had grub problems, and do they use insecticides, right? So I think it's really important that even within the people who take care of it themselves, there's a wide range of things you can do. Now, when we get into the commercial sector, right, to make it economically viable, one of the models is you guys is, well, we apply things, right? And product costs something, labor costs something, my licensing costs something, right? And so there's money associated with the applications of things, because that's the way we've built this model, right? That's the way the model's been built to this point, that commercial landscapers, let's talk about the cutting separate from the, the care of the landscape, the care of the plant. You have to mow, right? You're going to trim, right? And you're going to do the bushes and the flowers. Maybe you do some hardscape, and then you're going to apply things, right? Maybe you water, maybe you set the irrigation system. We're going to talk about some tips for that. Maybe you do the fertilizer. Okay, let's have a conversation about what smart fertilizer. Maybe you do the pesticide use. Okay, let's talk about what pesticide use looks like moving forward, because I think we're going to have to be creative as an industry if we're going to adapt to the kinds of things that these freshwater bodies will require us to do. And if not, they're just going to write laws. So we might as well start figuring this out right now. It happens to be National Lawn Care Month. in April. And for those of you that aren't members of your regional and national associations, let me encourage you to stay educated, because the easiest way to keep your customers is to be really smart and to figure out how to run your business in a very smart way. And whether it's efficient routing or fuel efficient vehicles or spot treating equipment or those ride-on applicators, whatever it is you're using, right? You better be trained and knowledgeable about the right time to do it. What we're talking about here is beyond the blanketed approach to simply doing the routine, wall-to-wall fertilizer, wall-to-wall pre-emergent, wall-to-wall broadleaf, wall-to-wall insecticide. I think this is a conversation as an industry of moving through a little bit more thought and creativity in the way we do those things, because it seems like the routine way of doing it is really what's an aspect that is troubling to many. All right. Before we get into anything, let me talk to the professional landscapers out there and say this has been a tough year on people in our business. There was a lot of uncertainty for a really long time. And again, the National Association of Landscape Professionals have addressed this, right? They're very well aware that you got to take care of yourself. You want to be good at anything, you got to take care of yourself. And as professional land managers in this business that is relentless, especially if you're plowing snow, I think it snows in Chautauqua. I haven't been out there too much in the winter, but I'm fairly sure it snows pretty good. So I'm hoping you guys are taking good care of yourself. And what we learned during this pandemic that's important for us to translate to lake-friendly lawns is, we were being asked what was essential about a year ago. And our industry as a whole had to say, well, I got less guys. That means I don't have time to get out there and make these applications, or I don't have time to do these practices. But I'm still, hey, you know what? That one was still pretty good. Well, how do I talk to my customer about, I did less, but I think you got to pay me the same amount of money, because I think what I'm doing it actually works a little bit easier, right? I don't know how you keep that money for not doing those services when the lawn still looks good. But for sure, almost everybody realized they could probably get by with a little bit less than they thought. Now, it also meant you had to take care of yourself. A lot of guys described it as gym protocol, right? You got to clean everything at a distance. Working on landscaping crews these days is no small task. And my experience has been that there's just a lot of trucks on the road, right? Instead of having a bunch of guys. And now that the vaccine's coming, we'll see how this works among the population of people who do this work. And hopefully there's safety and some confidence that the vaccinations and the way we're going to work as a society, science will prevail, at least for now, with regard to the vaccine. We still have to mind our P's and Q's about the way we take care of ourselves. All right. No conversation is good without the weather for me. If we're going to talk about lake-friendly lawns, and I'm talking about it here in April of 2021, I would like it to be different if I talked about it in April 2022. So let's talk about the big differences, which was how the weather went last year. And probably no surprise to anybody, it was among the warmest year on record. If you consider we've been keeping weather records since 1895, that's 126 years. Our region of the country, and you can see most of the continental United States, was in the record warmest, much above the warmest rankings ever. So we are warming. And for us, not as much as the Carolinas, and certainly here in certain pockets in central New York, we were fairly moist, but in general, we were considered average precipitation. Now, that's a very good thing to keep in mind, because we still will many years have average precipitation, but we'll have prolonged dry periods. And that's happening because when it rains, you get a bunch of rain. It doesn't look drizzle like it's been doing the last few days here in central New York, light drizzle. It's like a bucket and then nothing for 3 weeks, and then another bucket and then nothing for 3 weeks. And so you don't get good infiltration, right? The soil seals up and you get more runoff, which challenges lake-friendly lawns even more. Because the pure value, the absolute value why lawns are essential around lakes is their infiltration ability, their ability to let water infiltrate into that soil, become part of the natural filtering system, that even if it sheets lower and seeps into the lake, it's all the way through that biological activity, all the way through the slide of the soil and the pitch of the soil, before it gets into the lake. That's the best we can do in filtering anything that's coming down, because you know it's coming down the hill. Much of it in Canandaigua anyway is from farms. I would assume it's fairly similar in Western New York. Now, the summer was very warm. This created a lot of challenges for lawns. Even though we were average rainfall for the year, the summer was very, very warm, top 5 warmest ever through much of New York State. And as you can see, if you look at the precipitation ranks in the summer months, right, July to September, you start to see when you break up the weather into these divisional ranks, right, the way they rank up certain parts of the way NOAA puts together the country in these boundaries, you can see that, you know, out in Western New York, there was along Allegheny Plateau was fairly dry, but here in Central New York, we were a little bit wetter. So, you know, around lakes, this is going to have a big impact, because if you're wet, if your soil's constantly wet, you have to be very careful what you put on that lawn, even if it's a good thick lawn. If the soil's soaking wet, if rainfall comes, the water won't go in. It's going to start to sheet with the stuff on it. Now, a good dense lawn will prevent that from happening. But there is some due diligence the landscape professionals have to do to make sure the soil's not overly saturated, because then you're asking for trouble. Okay, so where are we today? How about where we are today? Let's look at the soil temperatures throughout much of New York State. Now, this is a little bit old, the end of last week, but you can see out in Western New York, you're still in the upper 40s. So things should be very slow, especially by the lakes, although the lakes were warmer. And a lot of Buffalo, when you look at growing degree days, is well ahead of normal. You guys, up until recently, out in Western New York, and even in Canandaigua, are 14 to 21 days ahead of normal. 14 to 21 days ahead of normal. So things are really pushing recently, and the soils are creeping up. The soils require the air temperature to warm consistently. This up and down stuff keeps soil temperatures a little bit cooler, because nothing's better for enhancing the infiltration of a lawn than the grass roots continuing to grow and the tops continuing to fill in the surface so the soil isn't exposed and it can remain competitive against summer annual weeds like crabgrass. Now, recently, it's been a bit on the dry side. We've been a bit on the dry side up until recently. There are parts of the Northeast that have been fairly wet, but overall, we've been fairly dry across the state in the last several weeks. Now, here's a little tidbit for the pro guys. We're seeing a lot of this problem. This is one of those funny things that, you know, I've been at this for 30 years, and, you know, things that you were told about how fungal diseases work in lawns. You know, now that we're having this persistently cool, wet condition the last several days, I've started to see some what we see out here called red thread. Now, it's pretty cool looking from a micro perspective. And in the past, it was always just associated with low fertility lawns that weren't growing very well. Now, because, you know, things have been advancing and then they get cold, the plants start to grow, warm up, maybe you've even mowed, and then they sit there for 4 or 5 days because it's cold and wet. And that kind of sort of fluctuating growth and then wet conditions makes plants more susceptible to these kinds of lawn problems. So, you know, in many ways, our idea of late season fertilizer to get things woken up in the spring, there's some value to that if you need the traffic tolerance. But on the other hand, with the way we have these fall springs, you know, it gets warm and then it gets cold again and it gets snow. We're gonna have snow tomorrow. You know, it really creates ideal environments for these particular problems. And I got to tell you, you don't spray for this. You scratch it up and you patch it with some seed. You scratch it up and maybe it grows back. You scratch it up, you sprinkle a little fertilizer, get it growing again. What you don't want is it to stay bare, because then when the heavy rain comes, now you got soil moving, right? It's really important to keep these lawns good and thick, so they can prevent the runoff. Now, invariably, what I get asked, and of course, you know, I'm sure this gets the rancor of some people when it comes to lake-friendly lawns, is people spray for broadleaf weeds. You know, they spray things with 2,4-D in them, MCPP, dicamba, all the very typical herbicides. There's typically more active ingredients in these broadleaf herbicide combinations. And we've done some work looking at timing. Spring is not a good time to control weeds. It's when you see them, but it's really hard to make one application of weed control in the spring and not have to make another one in the fall. This is what I mean about being creative. You got to make people want weed-free lawns. If people want weed-free lawns, there's still ways to give them weed-free lawns with spot treating at the right time, because spot treating at the right time reduces herbicide use 95% compared to blanketing it in the springtime, right? So let's just say we don't have to ban everything. You want a weed-free lawn. You don't have to be crazy about it. You find the right time and you spot treat. You don't blanket the place where you don't have a problem. And so that creates operational challenges. How do you spot treat? Do you go back? How do you do your routing? You send the trucks out, How do you get paid for that? Listen, I'm not saying this is the easiest thing. I'm saying this is the conversation we have to have if we want to give people what they want and still want. I'll leave it to Carol and Whitney and everybody else to get people to change their mindset about lawns. That is certainly an issue that people need to take up. But if you're a professional landscaper, you've probably been hired to provide a certain kind of lawn to a person. They're probably paying you to produce a certain kind of lawn. And I believe it probably includes fertilizers and pesticides. And that's why I'm talking to you folks about it like this, because you're going to use it. So if you're going to use it at the right time, and that you don't have to use as much, and you use, guess what, 95% less. But it takes a little more time. Remember what I said earlier, the key to a lot of this is being creative. Now, historically, what we talk about at this time of year, invariably throughout the Northeastern United States, and we have data-driven tools that are online, the GDD tracker. You can go to GDD tracker at Michigan State University. You can just Google it, and you can put your zip code in, and it'll tell you when you got to get your pre-emergence herbicides down. Now, I think this is something that we've got to change in a big way. This weed and feed stuff with the pre-emergence in the spring is like it's like a baptism. Every year, the lawn's got to get baptized with weed and feed and pre-emergence crabgrass in the springtime. And I would really like us to think creatively, because that again is treating the entire piece of property when maybe the whole property doesn't have a crabgrass problem. Right? But it requires, as my colleague from Rutgers got me started last week, Matt Elmore, he's the weed scientist down there, says you have to be more creative. So let me help you with a big issue that I know a lot of professional landscapers deal with is crabgrass. A lot of people don't want to see this. And this is one where I can justify using some measure of control to keep it out, because it fills in bare areas. It grows and then it dies and it leaves the soil bare. And that is a problem. We can debate broadleaf weeds in a minute, but in general, crabgrass is one of those annual weeds that fills in rapidly in bad soils many times, fills in certain places like along the curb here, and because you're not growing good grass. So let's get some competition in there and let's see what comes up. And then you've got to go back and do some spot treating. Remember what I said, you got to be creative, but these are not impossible things to do. You have to know the life cycle of how crabgrass works, right? It germinates from a seed. It's not there year round, right? And so in the winter and before it germinates, when it's raining and snowing and washing into the lake, nothing's there. That's the problem and the justification for why we got to get crabgrass out. It's not to blanket the place with pre-emergence. It's to grow thicker plants so that the crabgrass doesn't have an opportunity to fill in. So here's what it looks like, right? You come on the Cornell campus, this is what we have. Areas where kids cut through. There's a steam pipe here where it's tough to grow cool season grass. You can see again along the curbside, and then it just gets spotty. But that's because we didn't throw any seed out here. People think, oh, what do I got a seed? I got a lawn. And I think that this is a big part of the conversation I want to have with the landscape industry moving forward, because seed is perceived and is innocuous. It doesn't have an environmental impact. It's just new plants into the system where it's bare. How about instead of a weed and feed, you go out and blanket the place with seed and give the grasses a chance to come up, and maybe try different varieties that might be better adapted to those conditions that are out there, because eventually the crabgrass starts to germinate. And what you have to understand about control of this plant post-emergence, let's say that I waved my magic wand and no more pre-emergence was applied around lakes in New York State where there were lawns. Let's say I waved the wand. What would everybody do? Well, they'd have post-emergent herbicides. There's a few of them that'll be able to be used, but to use them effectively when the plants start coming up, you've got to get the right timing. This is a clear indication of where, the bigger it is, the different chemicals work. And again, we're talking spot treating these things and then figuring out, well, why do I keep having crabgrass here? If I keep having crabgrass here, well, maybe I got to fix the soil. Maybe I got to try a different grass. Maybe I got to cut that tree down. I know everybody, Nina especially, gets mad when I say that. So you got this bare ground, right? Putting a weed and feed on this kind of stuff is just really, it's irresponsible, honestly, because that pre-emergent herbicide to stop the crabgrass is going to stop anything from coming up. And now you got bare ground guaranteed for 10, 12 weeks, right? So this is the root of why we need a dense, healthy lawn. And my colleague who was chatting with another colleague here at Cornell, my colleague Carl Scamenti, who was chatting with Betsy Lamb in our integrated pest management program, she had this little tip of the day: underseeding or not seeding enough is overrated. Instead of overseeding is underrated, right? Overseeding is underrated. Underseeding is overrated. We need to use more seed if we don't want to use as many chemicals. And if we're going to use chemicals, we're going to have to use them at the right time, in my opinion, in a spot treatment fashion. Now, am I saying absolutely no pre-emergent herbicide anywhere? No. There might be places where, you know what, I have tried everything at sideways and it still pops in here. You put it in a band in a particular area where it's really always noticeable there, and this gets you through. You're still reducing your use 80%, 90%, just by doing patches, not just spots, but even patches of pre-emergence. Now, here's the long time picture that my colleague Dave Chinnery in the Capital District, one of our longtime extension faculty, and I collaborated years and years ago, and this continues to happen in a variety of different ways throughout New York State. The idea of applying seed regularly to a sports field during the season when they're playing. So instead of waiting at the end of the year, we wait in a sports field. Let's say, imagine a soccer goal mouth starts to wear out after a few games. Most of you know this. There's mud in there. As soon as we start to see a little bit of dirt, we start throwing ryegrass seed or tall fescue seed pretty quickly, very lightly, but weekly. And we'll do that for 10 straight weeks. This is a picture of a study that we did it with a drop spreader over this sports field. This was the following year. This was a year after we stopped doing the overseeding. You can see the strips really clearly in these lawns. Let me get my pen. It's really as clear as day. You can see the strips in these lawns, right? Where we did the overseeding, and the crabgrass where we didn't, right? So we know that plant competition in a perennial system like the lawn is a good way to keep the weeds out, right? I mean, our brothers and sisters in production agriculture that till the ground or use no-till, they are absolutely reliant on chemical herbicides because they don't have plant competition. The darn ground has got to get planted every year, once or twice, right? So that's a landscape that is in serious need of help in filtering the stuff that is likely to come off of it. That's why you see all of these lake associations investing in buffer strips and grass waterways and sodded areas to stop all the stuff that's coming off the agricultural fields that are regularly planted and have to get to a certain height, right? That critical weed-free period that they have in production agriculture before they don't have to worry about weeds anymore. So in turf, we're simply not exploiting our ability to outcompete the weeds enough. Now, here's invariably what happens through the summer months, and this is an urban situation where you can see the grass is starting to go dormant in the middle of the lawn here. You see all these grasses, and then the yellowy stuff is all the crabgrass. The crabgrass is thriving. Once it gets established, it's a warm season grass like corn. It needs a spit. The dew can keep it going for a couple of weeks before it starts to shrivel up. So crabgrass has a competitive advantage in the summer months. So if we're going to think about using different grasses, and you're going to come along with me on this idea where, all right, I'm going to use chemicals in a spot fashion. All right, I'm going to seed. Now we got to decide what we're going to use. What are we going to use? Now, one of the things that we've learned is a lot of the best looking Kentucky bluegrasses that professional people use, we try to buy the best seed, it's going to be quite a bit more expensive. A lot of turmoil in the seed business, a lot of turmoil in the fertilizer industry. Those prices are going up, estimates 25, 30% for seed and fertilizer. It's going to hit in different ways at different times. But for sure, the prices are going up, and even more so for good varieties. There's 173 different Kentucky bluegrasses. I wouldn't presume to tell you that this is the way every single one of them behaves when you don't put fertilizer on it. This is a sodded area in Wisconsin. After 3 years of not putting a fertilizer, putting on 4 applications and putting on 2 applications. Now you could put on 2 applications and do spot treating, but you see that really to keep the weeds out, and you still don't keep them all out, right? You still got to do some spot treating because bluegrasses tend to require a fair amount of maintenance. You've got to find ones that might be certified as more sustainable. There's a couple of organizations that I've talked about in previous lake-friendly lawn care programs. You can watch the webinars that are available where I've talked about third-party verifiers of varieties that use less water, that require less fertilizer, that grow slower, that are lower input grasses. You can find bluegrasses that are like that, but this is more of what is on the market right now. So perennial ryegrass, which comes up quick, we love it. Patches, really good, but doesn't like the dry summers, right? If you, and the question, should you water your lawn? Do I think you should water your lawn through the summer months? I think you water your lawn to prevent it from going dormant. I don't think you should irrigate your lawn to keep it emerald green. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have a little bit of brown edges around the lawn where maybe the sprinkler system doesn't hit as well, and that weakness gets exposed when it gets drier, and you'll see that worse with perennial ryegrass. I look at perennial ryegrass as mostly a patch grass. If you've got bare areas in your lawn, get some good perennial ryegrasses. They tend to be inexpensive, and you can make those applications. They'll come up quick, and they'll be really good in competing like that picture showed a few minutes ago. But really, the grass that we've seen move into more environments over the last 2 decades of my time here at Cornell that I started talking about 20 years ago when I got here, because I was seeing what Rutgers University was doing to make the improvements in these grasses. Right. And the improvements in these grasses have basically been to make them look a lot more like Kentucky bluegrass, but they're a lot more deeper rooted. They tolerate a little bit of shade better than the average Kentucky bluegrass. Right. And they tolerate drought better. And they actually keep the weeds out. As you can see here, with no fertilizer, we don't see a lot of weeds in tall fescue. It has properties that have a tendency to keep the weeds out. And also it has good traffic tolerance. But this ain't K31. This isn't the cheapest tall fescue you can get. This is a little bit more expensive tall fescue varieties, right? Because the better ones are the newer ones that are developed. They've got a little bit more disease resistance. They're a little bit darker blue-green. They're a little bit finer textured. But to be really successful with tall fescue, you have to seed it at a low rate every year. I want at least 1 application of seed over the whole lawn every year. And if you've got bare spots there, I want multiple seeding treatments in those areas, because that's how I stop using herbicides. If I can get grasses to grow in those areas. Now, maybe the people listening, well, why don't we have a bean lawn? Hey, I'm not, absolutely. If you embrace a diversity in your lawn, that's a totally different conversation. But I know very few professional landscapers who offer those kinds of services. A lot of what we're learning about these things has as much to do with how much we mow, right? I mean, part of one of the things we can do to help in many ways is to cut back on our mowing. Let things grow a little bit taller. Let things flower a little bit, right? but I've worked in the landscape industry and I work with professional landscapers, and I can tell you the following. It is really good, this no mow May, where everybody's not going to mow their lawn in the month of May, like I guess men do no shave, no mow November or something like that for a good cause. This is for pollinators, no mow May. Okay, that's fine. I'm all in. But I can tell you, you're going to put about 5 to 8 inches of leaf tissue, maybe more, depends if you fertilized, in that 1 month. That if you don't mow, you're going to have, the other problem is you don't have a mower that you can set high enough to cut it back down, right? That's a whole nother aspect of this discussion, is that, well, you want to not mow as much, then being able to process the tissue is a problem. So as we get into a diverse lawn, I'm going to come back to that at the end. But as we begin to think about not mowing as much, not watering as much, not fertilizing as much, it really starts a lot with the plants you grow. And having the latest tall fescue variety seems to be the way to use the least amount of stuff from many perspectives. Oh, let me give you an example of this. This is a tall fescue time lapse. We planted tall fescue here on the campus. It's been the grass that we spec on our campus now for the last decade. And we continue to improve the varieties, work with our local seed producers to get the best varieties. Now, in this case, we sodded it with some Saratoga tall fescue sod, had some bluegrass in it. And so this is the redoing of the area that was, because we enclosed this area, it actually got like a Washington, DC climate in Ithaca. So we were able to produce this really warm microclimate on campus. And of course, my colleague Nina Bassick planted trees, that you generally don't see north of Washington, DC. But of course, grass is the last thing done. So here's the preparation for putting the tall fescue in. You can see no particular care paid to the soil. And so it's really crappy. So we laid the bluegrass tall fescue sod in the first year, and then went through the season. The snow came the following year, and the snow mold came and immediately took out so much of the Kentucky bluegrass that was in this stand. A lot of times when you buy sod, the sod has a fair amount of Kentucky bluegrass in it, so it ties together. And if it comes in and it's very happy, that Kentucky bluegrass roots in and starts to grow. It's a mixture of these plants in a sod. So then this is about a month later from that snow mold. You can see it starting to recover. And then we added a little bit of seed. We didn't do anything but just throw the seed over the top, no fertilizer or anything, because compost was mixed into that soil down below. And then, of course, every year we put tents on these areas and drive on it and beat it up. And this is what it looks like pretty much every day when a tent's not on it. And it's become a really hardy tall fescue area. It doesn't get a fertilizer application. It gets one maybe once every 2 or 3 years, because tall fescue is really capitalized on that good, healthy soil underneath it. And so since I'm talking about soil, let me transition really well to how important understanding the soil is, but not understanding it from the perspective that I think a lot of my industry understands it. Most of when we talk about the soil in the turfgrass industry, we're talking about a soil test. Oh, I'll give you a soil test. Oh, you gotta have a soil test. Let's get a soil test. And that means it's a soil chemical test 99.9% of the time. We're selling a soil chemical test. Now, what might come back with that soil chemical test is organic matter percentage, cation exchange capacity, and some guess at texture. Texture is a physical property. Organic matter percentage is a physical property. And so while we tend to be fixated on our soil chemical properties with a soil test, because we want to see how much fertilizer and nutrients, because, God forbid the lawn doesn't have enough fertilizer, as if we haven't, maybe we build up a little bit of fertilizer in there, or maybe there's fertilizer in the organic matter. I want to just say the way we think about fertilizer in the lawn care industry also needs to evolve and be a little bit more creative. But let's talk about what the real problems are most of the time. Most of the time, people who have poor, chronically poor lawns have two things in common. One is there's not enough light, there's too much shade. That's the killer in any green plant like this, other than hostas, my wife tells me, moss and fern, things like that. And poor soil physical properties. Sometimes like this, it's thin soil, right? A very thin soil. Now, if you have a really deep soil, you can take advantage of not using as much stuff simply because the roots have the ability to mine a different volume of material. It's a larger batch of soil that the roots can take stuff up out of, right? So that thin soil, you know, stuff moves through or the plants take it up and it becomes a smaller reservoir for things like water and nutrients. And also plants won't root as deeply, so when it gets dry, they're not going to tolerate it as well. There's no fertilizer in the world you're going to put on that's going to fix this problem. This is a longer term problem that needs a little bit more creativity to deal with, because it oftentimes involves redoing the surface or dramatically doing some soil amendments, right, to make the soil a little bit more successful. Now, why is it important to make the soil good, and why is it important to have these lawns near the lake? Because as I started saying in the very beginning of the presentation with regard to the weather, we got an average amount of rainfall this past year through much of New York State. I know my region was about 25 to 30% above normal, and other regions were about 25 to 30% below normal, right? And that makes it normal. And what we all found was when the rain came, it came in intense rainfall. And if you look at the data about how many more downpours we're having, you're seeing it going up. Why is this important? Well, if you put water on a soil or a lawn faster than it can go in the ground, guess what it does? It pools up, and if there's a slope, it sheets and it flows. Now, a lawn has the ability to make that water snake down like plingo in before it gets to the lake. And as it's slowing it down, it's allowing it to infiltrate, right? And that is even more important with the way we see the climate changing. I wish we could start to have climate smart lawns instead of lake friendly lawns, because a climate smart lawn also is a lake friendly lawn. Right? A climate smart lawn is managing it for maximum infiltration, managing it to mow less, managing it to use less fertilizer, managing it to use less water, right? Maximizing the benefits it can give us, right? Maybe diversity, maybe infiltration. These issues that are happening now at the end of my career, that is really, we've got about 20 more years, best we can guess from the climate scientists, about 20 more years of these transitional times where we're going to get this crazy stuff. And then the climate's going to settle in for a little while. And it's going to, you know, we're going to get another 100 years of something much warmer than it is now before we start to see a shift again. So adapting to this for us around lakes is not unlike adapting to it in an urban area, right? And I want my landscape contractors, particularly those of you that have contract, you don't have a lawn that you take care of that's right next to the lake, but you got a lawn in the village, and that village has got a sewer next to it. You know, that house that you got a lawn on, it's got a storm sewer next to it and a lawn panel, and there's a whole bunch of paved land out there. That's an even bigger risk in many ways than living right next to the lake. In fact, if you live in the village next to a storm drain, you got lakefront property, because if it goes in that storm drain, it's heading probably to the lake in one way, shape, or form. So we got a lot of successes getting people sweeping the streets more, right? Get the old street sweepers out. Because one of the things we notice in the springtime with the weed and feeds, is just as much of it winds up on the pavement. And then the poor guys in the landscaping business in Westchester County, they're banning blowers. You can't use blowers anymore, right? This is a big thing, noise and emissions, and I'm all for getting rid of the 2-cycle engines. But if you're going to manage granular and use granular products in urban areas with a lot of pavement, right? With a lot of impervious surface. Look at this. Obviously this is a city, high density, but maybe medium or low density. You see the change in the infiltration. This is the number that we want to keep as high as possible so that we're maximizing the benefit that that lawn provides. And the way to do that is keep it fairly dense and thick. Now, the question still remains, does it have to be weed free? And my answer is not necessarily, but it can't have crabgrass and annual weeds that don't stick around, right? Because the runoff is coming, the rains come. Oh, this was a recent storm, I think. I love when this happens. This was right out in front of my house, right? And so everything on the road, I have a colleague who studies ditches, right? This stuff is on its way to Cayuga Lake, right down that ditch. Now, thankfully, some of the particulate's going to come out of it, but I don't fertilize my lawn. Well, I have a farm, but I don't fertilize the lawn of my house. This is the problem. If we get saturated, you can't be applying products when it's like this, number one. Number two, if your lawn's like this, you got to fix that soil. You got to fix that soil as much as you can. But obviously, at some point, there's so much rain, you can't do anything with it. Now, my colleague, before he retired, Marty Petrovic, was here for many, many years, one of the great turfgrass water quality scientists that we've ever had in our discipline, did a fair amount looking at different types of lawns and how much things run off of them. And one of the things that they found was where they kept, applied some fertilizer, applied some spot weed control, compared to not putting anything, just mowing and having a thinner lawn versus a thicker lawn here, a thinner lawn here on low maintenance turf, even compared to a woodlot. Sometimes woodlots have the leaves on them, and when the trees don't have the leaves on them and the rainfall gets down to that leaf matter, it can sheet across that as well, especially as it gets frozen. So it's really important to understand that there is a connection and there is a value to having this landscape type in urban areas, in and around lakes. The grass buffer strips between the plowed farmlands is a good example of the value that a good, thick, vegetated area can have. So I just skip over some of the particulars about it. But again, simple. For those of you that are DIYers that are here listening, or even for those of you that are professionals, you're going to apply fertilizer along where it meets the pavement. Use a drop spreader. Don't bring the rotary spreader all the way to the edge, right? So let's think about fertilization for a second and recognize one of the great values of grasses. Grasses build soil. I'm going to take a drink while you let that sink in. Grasses build soil. Soil that can eventually begin to sustain a grass system. Allows the plant to grow, and what it does is it brings in all this organic matter. It grows roots down deep. It builds up all this organic matter at the surface that's not mixed with the soil. Now, if it's mixed with the soil, if the organic matter is mixed with the soil, we call it mat. If the organic matter doesn't have soil mixed in it, we call it thatch. Now, a little bit of thatch, okay. Too much thatch, no good. If you have a big thatch problem, it is not something that just dethatching it or aerifying it is going to fix. If you have more than 3/4 of an inch of thatch, you need some serious remediation that those practices are not necessarily going to solve. So let's talk about the value that this organic matter has in helping you reduce the amount of nitrogen you should be applying to lake-friendly lawns or any lawn that drains in the watershed. Right? Any lawn that drains in the watershed should be thought of in this way. Over time, sometime between year 10 and 25 years, once you've got grass building that soil for about 10 years, it begins to have enough nitrogen stored in that organic matter that if you simply have a little bit of water to add or it gets some rainfall, when that soil gets warm, it releases the nitrogen naturally. So pretty much for most of us in upstate New York, once the soil gets to about 60 degrees, which, you know, who knows, in Chautauqua, it might be a while yet, but things are ahead of normal. So you might think maybe by the end of May, by Memorial Day, you'll be at 60 degrees temperature. Now the soil organisms, the soil life begins to process that organic matter, right? Process it, digest it, and release the nutrients to the plants that are actively growing and happy to take it up. So the temperature's there. Most of the time, all you need is a little bit of water. So you get, most of the time we get enough rainfall. So if you can get enough rainfall in that soil, you can keep it functioning for a good 6 months of the year that the soil will stay above 60 degrees temperature, right? Maybe 5 months, depending on where you're at. So, you know, you have to wonder, why am I fertilizing during that period of time if I've got an older lawn? And therein lies, you can reduce your fertilizer use maybe 2/3 just by not doing that, waiting for the soil to warm up, right? And then using nitrogen that's in the soil, and especially if you're returning clippings, which you all should be doing. You should be mowing the lawn as high as you can mow it and returning the clippings. It's important that you do that to not pull away the nutrients. Right now, they track in with the pet, they track in with the, and I can tell you, they track in, and if you're spraying pesticides, our work at Cornell, we have a scientist in textiles and rugs that said, hey, a lot of pesticides come off the lawn into the house. So in some ways, if you're going to put pre-emergence everywhere, post-emergence everywhere, you better collect the clippings for a period of time, because there's residues in those things, for no question about it. Do I think it's problematic, a health hazard? We're going to die if we encounter them? No, but they can accumulate. You keep doing the same thing year after year. You start bringing the pesticides in year after year. Is it a problem that you get exposed to a little bit of pesticides in your grass clippings in and of itself? No, but the reality is what we're learning is the scale of way we're using these pesticides in other parts of our society and other parts of our lives are starting to become a problem. And the same is true for fertilizer use. So whether you're a lake-friendly lawn or a climate-smart lawn or anybody doing a lawn, you need to be thinking about these broader issues and think about a nutrient program you can sustain. You're going to do a soil test that's going to tell you how much nutrients to put down. Send the soil in, look at the numbers, compare them to these, right? If these numbers compare to your numbers, if your numbers are all above these numbers or below in the case where certain things can be toxic, if your numbers are all above, then you don't have to fertilize anything but a little bit of nitrogen for growth, right? Maybe a little bit of potassium, depending on how dry you get. There could be, if your soil's not at the, if it's close to this level. But here's another thing I'll tell you. If you take a soil test, look at these numbers say you're deficient, but your lawn looks good and it's doing well, the soil test is wrong. We don't have enough research data to say this is absolutely the do-all end-all. It's a method of interpreting that you have to be creative in the way you do it. You can't just blanket it everywhere. If you want to do something that's a minimum level and sustainable, it has to be following some of these lower interpretation guidelines. Now, if you send your soil to us here at Cornell, this is the way we interpret them. All right. We get a lot of questions about nitrogen use, particularly on Long Island, any place there's water involved. So the question that got asked is, how much nitrogen does scientific research say a lawn in the Northeast needs? And of course, no surprise, there's, at least 2-3 dozen papers that are pertinent to this topic. And you can see ones that are as low as 1 to 2 pounds of N, which is maybe 1 or 2 applications, maybe 3, or 4 to 6 pounds of N. Now, some of that's related to, well, that lawn had a lot of traffic, or that lawn we just looked at and it was kind of shady. Well, the shady and it was just looked at was on the low end, and the traffic air lawn was at the high end. So, you can look at different ways that amount of nitrogen you need. But what we're looking for in our industry and our research, that we're trying to curate and get out to the industry is a nitrogen or a fertilizer rate that protects water quality and maintains the lawn performance, because I still need the lawn to do its job. It's ecosystem services, it's pollinators, it's infiltration, it's noise, it's dust, it's everything it does, having these vegetated areas in the environment there. We've got to do it with water quality protection in mind. So what is a defensible rate? A defensible rate is somewhere between 2 and 2.7 pounds. So that could be as many as 3 fertilizer applications, depending on the rate that you use. Let's say you're on the Scott's program And generally their lawn fertilizer puts on about 7/10 of a pound to 9/10 of a pound to a 5,000 square foot lawn. So if you get 9/10 of a pound, you can make 3 applications till you get to 2.7. Once you get, the older your lawn is, the less nitrogen it should need. And the older your lawn is, if you keep applying high rates of nitrogen, the research continues to show that these systems leak, like a septic system leaks. If you've been using high rate nitrogen over a long period of time, you're going to get a leaky system. You have to adjust your nitrogen rates down where you're just looking at the grass. In places where it wears out, you've got to maybe target it and put up a little bit more nitrogen there. This idea of just one thing for the whole property when you're that concerned about things that go on your lawns this is the way forward, is what can you defend and how do you do it? So let me give you the simple guidelines that our industries in the Northeast should absolutely positively be following if they're trying to protect water quality. And this is a publication that was done several years ago with a whole collection of scientists in the Northeast and the Water Pollution Control Commission. So we had a lot of people who were thinking about pollution control. And one of the things they did was they broke it out into sensitive areas and non-sensitive areas. And one of the things they said was, well, how many times do you normally fertilize? And, they gave you a chance to say, okay, if you do it once, here's how you do it. You do it twice, here's how you do it 3 times, 4 times. This is for non-sensitive areas. I would venture to say that most of the landscapes that drain into these watersheds, I would classify as environmentally sensitive areas, right? Which means, first off, no more than 3, and very specific guidelines for what those nitrogen sources should be. You see, in this case, if you're going to fertilize at all, it says late summer, 3/4 of the nitrogen as slow release nitrogen, and less than 2 pounds of nitrogen totally applied in these sensitive areas, right? So being able to look at publications like this, talk to your customers about what does science say I should be doing? What does science say is defensible? What does science say if you're going to fertilize? What's the most responsible way to do it? Right? I mean, a different discussion about whether you should or not, how good it's got to look, blah, blah, blah. Right? But for now, there are guidelines that I think people should be held to because these are science-based. People looked at where nitrogen went when they tried these studies that developed these numbers. Now, we're pretty much there. I got a couple of little slides here about just landscape stuff, knowing your lawn. I've talked a little bit about diversity and whether you should have clover or flowering plants in there. I can tell you that this complicates things immensely if you're going to apply anything. If you've got flowering plants on your lawn, you want to be careful about the grub control products that you use. That has nothing to do with water quality, it has to do with biodiversity and pollinator stuff. And so, is it a big deal that we use insecticides on lawns? Well, here's the problem. It's like I said earlier, we use so many insecticides in agriculture, in our production systems, that many people say, well, we shouldn't use them there either. But you know what? That's the system we got. And right now we're finding lots of problems with the heavy reliance on those products in those crops. So we have 2 pieces of information. One is there's a lot of it out there, even though it breaks down, there's a lot of it out there. And I'm not passing judgment on what our exposure does to it. There's a lot of it out there. I don't see any problem with using it in these environments, but we've got to use things smartly. And we've got to start thinking about these lawns, particularly in these sensitive areas, a little bit more cautiously. So rake the debris, keep the streets clean. Don't throw your clippings into the street, into the storm drain, clean up after your pet. Really simple, stupid stuff will go a long way to making our lakes, our 217 lakes, much, much cleaner than they maybe are, or at least keeping them clean. So I went right to the wire here, Whitney. I'm perfectly happy to stay and answer questions.
That's wonderful. So we're actually going to take a very, very brief 1 minute break. And we would love for everybody to use this 1 minute. I'm going to put a link here in the chat box And I would love for everyone to click on that link and fill out our super brief survey. It will take you less than 1 minute. And if you fill out the survey, you will automatically be entered to win. We're going to give out 4 gift cards for $25 each to a local brewery or eatery in your watershed. So please take that 1 minute to fill that survey out. Like I said, it's very short. It won't even take you the full minute. So we're going to take a break. And also, while we're waiting, if you have any questions, I see we've got a couple in our Q&A box. Please get those into that Q&A box so we can use Dr. Rossi's wonderful bank of knowledge to get those answered for you. And you can also, if you have any questions for either of us, we're happy to answer any questions you may have about either of our organizations as well. All right, wrapping up that 1 minute. Please go to that link real quick. It'll take you hardly any time. It's just trying to make sure that we're doing the best job that we can do to get you guys the information you need, and that we're covering topics that are meaningful to you all and whatnot. So I see some questions coming in. Keep those coming too. It's wonderful listening to, even though it's more geared towards landscapers, it's wonderful for me because we're talking about putting in a home and we're about to build and thinking about our lawn and what it's going to look like. And I made lots of notes. Use tall fescue.
Yeah. I mean, especially with lawns, right? That, you know, most of the time you get one chance when you're doing a lawn. It's not like landscapers are in the business and we train them to say, oh, you know, it doesn't work out, just replant the whole thing. It's actually when the lake's at biggest risk, when water quality is at the biggest risk, when the soil is exposed. So we already have a question here about patching lawns and using hay and straw to cover large areas. I do think, and I don't, you know, there's lots of different mulching methods, pelletized paper, jute, straw, you know, hydromulch. I'm a big fan, especially in these sloped areas of hydroseeding. I think it's really good for landscape companies to address, to have a hydroseeder available, even the small ones, you know, one shot, mulch, seed, fertilizer, all at once. We've had a lot of success. We see a lot of high-end golf courses and sports fields even doing spot seeding with hydroseeding because of the success of them. So the critical thing is to get that soil stabilized. So any way to do it, hay will help. But here's the problem. If you get it from farmer, you know, Frank down the road, who just took it off his, in a wheat straw field, I promise you're just going to have as much wheat and weeds planted in that lawn as you are grass plants. So if you're going to use a mulch, you know, and it's going to be straw, you want to get some assurance that it got cooked or heated or from a marsh or weed free in some way, because that tends to be a big source of a chronic weed problem. It's like, oh, I got orchard grass in there and I can't get it out of there, right? Because you don't mow it enough or you're not tending to it enough. It's hard to get out. So that's certainly, I like that that question was asked, because it really goes to the heart of having a good thick lawn. So Whitney, do you want to hand me the questions and let you take it from here?
Yes, I'm actually going to pass it over to our conservationist, Carol Markham, and she's going to field the questions for us.
Right. Awesome. Okay. Our first question is in terms of the shady areas you were speaking about, Frank. What alternative ground coverings other than grass might you recommend?
Well, the first thing is, okay, the short answer to the question is, I'm really not very good with shade tolerant plants. I can tell you myrtle and pachysandra and ground, not, you know, English ivy, and people yell at me, maybe it's a bit, okay, so listen. I don't know, but here's what I can tell you. My wife's got a book this thick of about 350 different hostas you could put in to these shade areas. And there's probably another 200 ferns. There are people who specialize in shaded garden areas, and I don't presume to be an expert in that at all. But here's what I will tell you. From my perspective, The critical thing is to recognize grass is not the right plant for that place. I don't care what we're talking about, Carol. It's always the right plant in the right place. And I'll be the first to tell you, there are plenty of places where we should put grass. You know why we put it there? Because it's easier. Because they don't know how to do something else. And I wouldn't presume to know how to do it because I'm not a ornamental plant guy. You'd think after all these years of getting this question, I'd probably have a few, I'm an old Italian guy. I plant Pachysandra, right? That's what my paisans all do. We plant Pachysandra. So I don't know, but the critical thing is if you don't get 4 hours of direct sun and you're fighting moss and you're fighting thin grass and you're fighting Dallas grass or ground ivy or whatever the weed is, or maybe clover is thriving, maybe violets are thriving. I don't know, Carol, what's the matter with that? As long as it's covering the ground, the key is that if it's going to be a bed, that it comes to full cover or it's mulch. You don't want to leave the soil exposed even under the trees, right? Because they collect a lot of those heavy rains and then drip them, right? For periods of time down below them. So it's good to still maintain good infiltration below that tree. So having something under there is going to be good. I can't tell you exactly which one. But it is funny about me being Italian wanting to plant Pachysandra. I've never used that line before, but I think
I was going to say, but we're going to talk you out of that. We're not going to. I was going to say, whoever asked that question, please feel free to reach out to me. Have Whitney put my email in the chat. I definitely have some native recommendations of some ground covers and or just like larger ferns, like Frank was mentioning, Solomon seal, wild ginger. There's really a lot that can definitely take over those areas. And I can even share a picture of what mine looks like right now because I have an area.
And you can Google shade garden plants for the Northeast. And you'll probably get 15 websites. Now, can I make a comment, Carol, about native, not native? I think that we've got to be really careful about that because I view plants as being functional. Now, when we talk about native, a lot of the function that we talk about with native is, they fit into this ecosystem, right? But we have screwed so mightily with the ecosystem that sometimes native plants can't actually fulfill their function as well in those environments, right? So I think saying the right plant in the right place is a good place to start. I think if there is widespread success with certain natives in certain environments, that should always be a good first choice because that builds the other layer of the web, right, of pollinators and soil microorganisms and pollen and everything else that sort of really should inhabit that particular ecoregion or ecoclimate, whatever you're talking about. I do think we need a lot more work. I've been starting to play around with some native grasses that grow underneath power lines and just grow up here in the Northeast when you cut the trees down and then you don't do anything, right? If you in the Northeastern United States, if you don't mow it, you're gonna have trees, and eventually it's gonna be trees. So if you mow it a little bit, there are some grasses that are designed to be mowed less, do better under low light. We don't know a lot about them yet. So a lot about the information I give you is very much based on the sort of, industrialized lawn approach that we've developed over the years. So but I just want to be clear that I don't like having labels on plants like, it's good because it's native, not if it doesn't grow well there.
Right.
I just put all these native plants, they all died. Wasn't that great?
Well, no, definitely we would want to be able to we would want to recommend natives that would be successful in that particular location. Absolutely.
Right. And it's soil, it's soil
correct.
Too, right?
Yes.
All right. How we doing?
Okay. How early in the spring can you plant grass seed in Chautauqua County?
I would say that's a great question because it's a twofold question. One is how late can you apply the seed in the fall? And then because that helps you. The beauty of really taking advantage of the spring is waiting till you're pretty much consistently below 50 degrees air temperature. As soon as you get consistently below 50 degrees air temperature, you could put seed out in the fall and it will sit there for most of the winter. You lose maybe 20%. So if you're really reliant on it, you can up your seed rate a little bit. And then in the springtime, the same rule applies. I wouldn't start applying until my soil got to about 50. Now, if you have a very bare area with open soil, even when it's 50 degrees during the day and the soil's 40 something, if the sun is beating down on that soil, it'll start to warm at least a half an inch in. So you can start to get it before you get to soil temperature 50. So we're really at an average temperature of 50 pretty consistently now through much of the Northeast. I'd say as soon as you get 5-6 days in a row, generally it's about a week, we'll say, it's okay to start putting the seed down and get it ahead of crabgrass, which in Chautauqua County, you probably got another 2-3 weeks before the crabgrass is going to germinate. But a lot of these cool season grasses will get a head start now. And if you do it with a patch mix, which is, it's a whole nother conversation for going to the garden center, but for professionals, they can do this better. But at the garden center, now basically all you get is patch mix or coated seed. So you don't get as much seed as you used to get. It's a very different seed world now. Anyway, that's the answer to that question.
Okay. What is the best way to address poor soil quality on an established lawn?
If there was an easy answer, we'd have figured it out. I think the problem with soil issues is that we got grass on top. And so the only way to really amend that soil is to be like Whitney and do it at the beginning really well. Test it physically, more importantly, physically. And then the move is to, here's how I would do it. I would lower the height of my lawn maybe about 30-40%. So if I kept it at 2.5-3 inches, I would lower it to about 2 inches. Expose some of the soil and then take a lawn air fryer, especially one that can go up and down, not the drum. The ones that go like this, they go in maybe this much. Now, if that's all you got, then you got to do that. But if you're only going in this deep, that means you're only fixing the soil this deep. If you're going in this deep, that means you're fixing the soil this deep without having to rip up the lawn, right? Now, the other thing that I'm going to tell you is that, the pretty much go-to move here is compost, but there's risk. I would not recommend you use biosolid compost. You don't want to be using stuff off a farm that's got a lot of nitrogen in it. It's got a lot of phosphorus in it. The yard waste, municipal waste composts that tend to be more yard waste based have a better carbon to nitrogen ratio that even if you just grew in that for a little while and it was only about an inch, it would still be really good. Sometimes you can't fix the soil. You've got to top dress and build the soil up on top of the crap that's there. It's still good to try to poke a hole and blend the amending compost that you're adding with the existing soil that's there. That's always the best thing to do. And you can do it by good aerification and then dragging it around. And then expect to do that for a couple of years because you can't do it at once because you expose too much soil, you get a rain and then it's in the lake. So you got to be very careful and the word for today is creative about the way you do these things.
Okay, wonderful. We have a question about weed growth. How much weed growth within the lakes is caused by excess phosphorus and nitrogen?
Well, I believe it's almost all caused by excess nutrients coming from the landscape. I don't think there's any evidence that lawns in and of themselves are significant contributors when you consider how most of these lakes are impaired. But for sure, those are the limiting nutrients that limit plant growth. If the lake doesn't have too much of them, you only get average amounts of vegetation or algal growth. If you get excessive amounts of those nutrients in there, which is the loading that we're talking about, you get plant growth, which then starts a cascade of bad things that leads to, killing and screwing up the biology of the lake, right? These are enormously sensitive biological systems that we've already impaired. And here's the bad news. If we stopped fertilizer today, we're 10, 15 years out from 20 years from solving a phosphorus problem. I mean, never mind lawns. I mean, we've banned phosphorus in communities in Minnesota for 15, 20 years, and they're seeing no decline necessarily in the runoff that's coming off of these areas with no phosphorus applied in the lawns for 20 years. And I think we, think about how many places we've taken phosphorus out of. Can't have it in soap, right? No more detergents. We've taken it out we've made farms be more mindful of their manure management because of the phosphorus loading. So, I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you the problems with our lakes are from excess nutrients.
Right. Okay. Helene asks what to do about heavy moss in shaded areas.
Carol, what should she do? You don't need me for this. What should she do, Carol?
My opinion, leave
Your
it.
opinion.
Leave it. It grows. You don't have to mow it. It's wonderful. Let it go.
Or what if they want to put plants in there? We just had this conversation.
Correct.
If you've got moss is a sign of like, hello, there's not enough light here for grass.
Right. Right.
So that's where you start, so many plants indicate what's happening. We call something a weed and the old, I think it was Whitman or Emerson said it's a plant whose virtue has not yet been realized, right? People like that for weeds, but these things will grow really well in these environments, in these low light environments. And as long as the ground is covered and infiltration is good, moss is a sign of a big problem with light.
Right, with light, exactly.
For grass, not for moss. For
right. But like I always say, it's much easier to manage and take care of. So just leave it. And if there is a chance that you want to intermix some plants, like Frank said, within it, you can definitely do that. But I would tend to just let it grow.
Yeah. Now you can't walk on it, can't play soccer on it. The dog's going to dig it up. So if you're looking for a multifunctional surface there, now you're talking about, okay, well, maybe you better thin the trees if you have that kind of an area that you want to use for something. But if it's under a tree and could be an easy bed or something that doesn't get walked on, or that it's moss, but maybe you put a couple of flagstones that you can step on the flagstones and go through it, that, again, being creative with the environment that you have. But it requires you to be clearly, you got to be aware of what we're using this area for. If a landscaper's hired and they say, hey, I want my kids to be able to play in my yard, and your yard's all moss, the first thing the landscaper should say is, well, I got to get more light in here. You want grass, I got to have more light. So you got to make adjustments to the climate to adapt the plant. Again, right plant, right place. If you know the plant you want, you got to make the place right. You got to make the place right.
All right. Nancy asks, our neighborhood is full of lesser celandine.
Yeah.
What can I do?
Isn't
I
that
have I have many patches, small and 5-foot square patches. Neighbors mow it after it blooms.
Perfect. Mow it after it blooms, and then it goes away. And then the grass fills in behind it, my experience. And if it doesn't, get some seed out there. That lesser celandine will be out of the way in another month. Flowered and dead and out of the way in another month. Scratch it up and reseed it. It's a spring ephemeral. This is exactly what's cool about lawns. Lawns can have these flowering plants that service these early visitors that are just, getting going. And we've sort of completely denuded the landscape of these plants we got them by roadsides. My roadsides tend to be littered with invasives that move up and down the highway system. But for sure, lesser celandine is one of those plants that's going to fade away and allow the grass to come in. And if you seed it there, you're going to have less of a problem. I'm looking for plants that can play nice, just like what we're looking for in society. We got to learn to play nice. We need plants that can play nice, right? Okay, a little bit of celandine. If the whole lawn is celandine and goes away, do you have grass that fits in there? Does it allow it to fit in there? Because then now you got to make a different decision. But it's been a banner spring for lesser celandine. I've seen it everywhere. I don't know. But again, if you want your kids to play soccer this spring, or the kids are pent up and they want to go out and play lacrosse or whatever it is they're playing, lesser celandine is not a safe surface for them to be playing on. They'll put their foot down and it'll slip. So we're talking about an ornamental situation here, not a functional situation.
Good point. Okay, I think we've already answered. The next one is she had commented, what is wrong with moss in shady areas?
Nothing.
Nothing. That's, yes, that just is what grows best there. Which alternative ground covers are best to walk on?
In the north, I think I've seen heel all. I don't think I've seen any plant, I don't think I've seen anything but grass tolerate traffic. In fact, I can show you pictures of areas where on golf courses, I work with the organic golf course out in Martha's Vineyard that hasn't used a pesticide in 20 years. So I've been studying weed control out there without chemicals because they've never used an herbicide. And one of the things we've noticed is where the traffic is, we don't get crabgrass. We don't get any weeds growing there. The clover doesn't grow there. Nothing grows there except grass. And so the answer to the question is, what was the question? Because that was
An alternative ground cover.
Yeah.
to
The
walk on.
problem with that's the problem. We don't have a lot of alternative ground covers that you can beat up on. That's what grasses really provide us. But again, if you need that traffic tolerance, you're going to be hard pressed to find a more cost-effective solution than grass. And I'll just tell you, if you put it on a decent soil, you don't have to do much to it other than mow it. Now, I think if you're really putting traffic on it, then obviously the fertilization and the weed control is going to be a different issue. But I think in general, getting the right plant on a decent soil and well fed to keep up with the wear and tear is going to get you a long way down the road. Then that's better than trying to find something that's not going to hold up very well to
Right.
traffic.
Is it better to use patch mix or the tall fescue that you mentioned for bare spots?
It is best to get the patch mix with a little bit of tall fescue and perennial ryegrass in it.
Okay. And is that fairly easy to find, Frank? I mean, is that?
Yes, most of, if you look, you go to any of the garden centers, and of course, all the commercial guys know this, you're going to get a tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass ryegrass, a tall fescue ryegrass, a tall fescue bluegrass combination, in any of these patch mixes or any of the small bags of stuff will work perfectly fine. It's good to have some different ones, a little bit of ryegrass to come up quick, and then the other grasses to establish later on.
Okay, all right. Same, very similar question. What's the difference in timing for planting grass seed in Canandaigua? But I'm assuming it would still be based on soil temperature.
That's exactly right. It's best to talk about soil temperature when the growing season is 2 weeks ahead of normal. Because if you wait for the calendar, you're 2 weeks late. So we can tell you we're hovering there much quicker than we would normally be there. And this is the reality of growing plants in a world facing a changing climate, is that you have to pay attention to some data, and the easiest data that's available anywhere or with a meat thermometer you could stick in the damn ground. There's absolutely no excuse to not know the soil temperature. Everybody's got a meat thermometer because we're all afraid of not cooking our meat enough now. The whole meat business has got us crazy about the way we cook. I grew up, my mother never used a thermometer. I did not die of poisoning, right? Now we got thermometers. Fine. Use it for your meat, clean it, stick it in the soil. And if you don't want to stick it back in your meat, buy another one for the meat. Have one for the soil. Every landscaper should have a soil thermometer and a knife on them to cut in the ground and get a sense of the structure, the rooting, the things that are going on. You don't need fancy probes. You can use a spade and just look at it, and get a sense of what's going on. So that's my 2 cents about that. Listen, okay. I gotta go. Are we good?
Okay.
We can talk for the whole day.
No, we're good. This last question, actually, you touched on already. So we're perfect. Thank you.
This is so great hanging out with you guys. So hopefully my landscape colleagues, my pro landscape guys, they know how to get in touch with me. I'm happy to yak with them about anything. And of course, thank you all for having me and for all the great work you do to keep the lake safe. I'm happy to support that work.
Thank you.
Thanks
so much, Frank. Great information as always. Thank you for
See you
your time
guys.
today.
Yes,
Thank you.
and thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I see that we had 24 people fill out our survey. If you'd like, here's the link again. Go ahead and fill it out. And like I said, you'll be entered for a gift card. We're going to draw 4 names randomly from the people that fill it out, and those 4 will get gift cards to brewery or eatery that's in your watershed. So thank you all so much. Thank you to our
Thank
co-hosts.
you.
Thank you,
Have a
everybody.
wonderful day.
Thank you guys for joining.
Yeah.
Oh, Nancy, I just put the link in. So in the chat, that link, if you click on that link, it will take you to the survey. Let me know if it's popping up for you, if you're seeing it there, Nancy. It should be a link out to SurveyMonkey. I love his enthusiasm.
Yes.
It makes lawn care exciting.
Yes, yes, as it should be. All right, well, I hope that that went through, Nancy, and anybody else who is looking for it, hopefully you can see that link there. And thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.